A light drizzle fell slowly over the city of Greenville, turning the sidewalks into opaque mirrors that reflected more loneliness than light. The tires of school bicycles left wet marks on the asphalt, while the morning followed its usual course for most. But for Margaret, this was no ordinary day. It was just another chapter in a routine that repeated itself with shame and silence. She was pushing with difficulty the wheelchair of Walter, her husband, a war veteran who could no longer rely on his own legs. He held a small blanket in his lap, covering his knees, but he could not hide the cold in his eyes. His fingers were still, and the gaze lost between the cracks in the concrete was not distraction. It was memory. He had already crossed battlefields, sandstorms, and shots in the dark. But that simple crossing to the bus stop seemed crueler than anything he had experienced in combat. Margaret wore an old raincoat, frayed at the edges, which clung to her body in the biting wind. Her grey hair escaped from under the hood. Even without speaking, she showed urgency. There was a haste in her steps that time no longer respected. Every meter she pushed seemed to carry not only the weight of Walter, but of everything they had lost in the last few years. When they finally reached the stop, the bus appeared at the end of the street. Margaret raised her arm in hope. Walter just looked sideways, already anticipating what was coming. The vehicle approached, stopped abruptly, and in a sudden movement, the driver opened the door. He didn't even get off the step. "I can't go up with this today. I'm late." The sentence sounded like a gunshot. The door closed before she could say anything. The metallic sound cut through the air, and the bus continued on, as if nothing had happened. As if they were just obstacles in the way. Margaret stood there, her hand outstretched, as if she were still waiting for dignity to have a second chance. Walter lowered his head slowly, as if he already knew that fighting for one's country was easier than fighting for respect on a wet sidewalk. Some passengers on the bus watched through the window and pretended not to see. Others laughed softly. Two young men at the next stop exchanged jokes as if the scene were part of a play. Margaret pressed her lips together, trying to hold back the tears. But her eyes, red, screamed what her mouth could no longer bear. Until when? And the cruelest thing of all is that it wasn't the first time. This was no exception. It was just another day when the city decided to ignore a man who, in times of war, would have been carried on its shoulders with honor. But across the street, someone was watching. Standing under a canopy, protecting his uniform from the rain with a leather briefcase, a young soldier watched the scene without saying a word. His eyes never wavered. He didn't take out his cell phone to film. He didn't shout at the driver. He didn't come any closer. But there was something about his posture, something firm, uneasy, as if each drop of that rain was marking a different kind of memory. His name was still unknown to anyone there. But what he would do in the next few hours would change not only that couple's day, but the way the entire city saw its silent heroes. And it all started with that door that refused to open. Stay with me, because what you're about to see next will restore your faith in something that seems to have been lost: respect. The noise of the bus gradually faded into the distance, but what remained was the echo of humiliation. Margaret pushed her chair with more force than her body would allow, without exchanging a single word with Walter. The dirty water from the sidewalk splashed on her shins, soaking her old socks and sharpening the pain in her knees even more. She could barely feel her feet, but she didn't want to feel them either. Maybe because what hurt the most at that moment wasn't physical. Walter kept his hands clasped in his lap, but his fingers were stiff, frozen, not from the cold of the rain, but from everything he carried inside. It was as if his soul were trapped by the wheels of that chair. He didn't look around. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the cracked floor, each crack like a memory. In the window of a barber shop, the reflection of the two said everything that no one on the street bothered to see. A man wounded, not only in his legs, but in his pride. A woman fighting against the world with the strength of love. And an entire city, too fast to stop. Across the street, Kyle Thompson stood motionless. His wet uniform clung to his broad shoulders, but he didn't move. His expression was one of someone who had just seen something he could no longer unsee. His eyes were fixed on Walter's face, a face familiar to any soldier. It was the face of silent resistance, of the soldier who had survived everything, except indifference. Margaret swerved down a side street, trying to avoid the potholes in the sidewalk. A car passed too close and kicked up a wave of water that hit Walter in the side. She didn't have time to complain. She just stopped and took a deep breath. Walter, even soaked through, didn't react. His eyes were far away, as if they had returned to the battlefield. In his mind, the screams were still real. The smell of gunpowder, the pain tearing through his legs, the helicopter exploding in midair, and the silence that came afterward when he woke up in the hospital with a doctor saying, "You are alive, but you will not walk again." There were months of bed rest, physical therapy, pitying glances, visits that diminished over time. The only constant was Margaret, who held his hand even when he didn't want to be touched. He remembered it vividly, her calling him "my hero," even when he didn't recognize himself as one. Now, decades later, that same woman was pushing him back into the house, wet, shaking, with her legs giving out. And he could do nothing but look forward and swallow his pride. Because all that was left there was this: silence. Kyle couldn't bear to look any longer. He grabbed his cell phone firmly. His fingers were shaking, but the number in his address book didn't require much thought. He knew exactly who to call. Not to report. Not to complain. It was something bigger than that. It was a reaction born of indignation at seeing an honorable man treated like dead weight. While someone on the other end of the line answered with a "Sir, at your service," Margaret and Walter turned the corner toward the neighborhood where they lived. The path was long, and each step from the chair seemed to take away another part of the dignity that was still left. On the next block, they passed a newsstand. A sign advertised a veteran support campaign. Colorful pictures, pretty phrases, American flags fluttering. Walter just glanced sideways. Margaret gripped the handle of her chair tighter, because what is said on the poster is one thing. What is experienced on the street is another. That afternoon, Walter didn't ask for anything. No help, no apologies. He just walked into the house, took off his wet coat with difficulty, and went straight to the porch, where he sat in the same place as always. Margaret went into the kitchen, her shoulders hunched, and began to make tea. Neither of them spoke, but both were broken inside. Outside, the wind was blowing leaves and spreading mud. Inside the house, the only thing that could be heard was the sound of the kettle heating up, almost like a metaphor, boiling inside, but without overflowing. Across town, Kyle was still downtown, talking to someone who seemed to understand the gravity of what he had just seen. This wasn't a normal phone call. And it wasn't the kind of thing you do on impulse. It was a decision. It was a principle. It was what separates someone who just watches from someone who does something. Meanwhile, the bus driver was finishing his last lap. He was commenting to a colleague about a couple who got in the way of the route and laughed as if it were a joke. The other driver didn't find it funny. He just nodded and said, "Your time will come too, my friend. Wait seated." But the man didn't understand. And maybe he shouldn't understand yet. Night was beginning to fall in Greenville. The city lights slowly came on, one by one, as if the darkness needed to be contained little by little. But in some houses, the lights on were not enough to dispel the feeling of invisibility. And on that balcony, Walter continued to stare into space. Only this time, something different was in the air. Not hope, exactly, but an invisible change. As if an old, forgotten gear had started to turn again. And that was what made it all so interesting. Because sometimes, a small action at the right time can cause something much bigger than you can imagine. Now, with the silence beginning to give way to what lies ahead, the story takes a new direction. And no, it won't be just any direction. Margaret knelt with difficulty, her knees creaking softly under the weight of age and frustration. With a frayed cloth in her hands, she wiped the mud from the wheels of Walter's chair, as if she were trying, with those short strokes of the cloth, to erase what had happened that morning. But no matter how much she scrubbed, no matter how much she wiped, the heaviest dirt remained embedded where no one could see it, in memory. Walter was right there, sitting on the porch, motionless. His eyes didn't follow the birds that came to the fence, nor the breeze that swayed the leaves of the guava tree. He looked ahead, but seemed to see nothing. The look in his eyes was the same one he had years ago, when he first heard that he would never walk on his own feet again. A look between emptiness and resistance, between silent mourning and wounded dignity. Margaret got up slowly, took the cloth to the sink, and washed it in silence. The dirty water ran, but what she really wanted was to wash away from her soul that feeling of helplessness that had been growing day after day. She picked up the kettle and put it on the stove. Her hands were shaking, not only from physical exhaustion, but from something that was eating away at her insides, the realization that, even after everything, no one seemed to care. She remembered a phrase she heard in the military hospital years ago, while Walter was still in a coma. Heroes are never helpless. That had sounded nice at the time, comforting. But now, it seemed like a cruel irony, because that man, who had supported his own country on his back, was now ignored by him even on public transport. As the water boiled, Walter stared out into the yard. His thoughts took him back to the jungle, to the day he had dragged 2 wounded soldiers 100 yards under enemy fire. The stench of blood, the whine of bullets, the screams, it all came back to him as if it were yesterday. And then the silence, the white, the chair, the metal. A metal that today rested dusty inside a box, in a closet that no one opened anymore. Across town, Kyle Thompson was no longer alone. Other men, wearing the same uniform and the same grim expressions, had joined him. Not by chance, not by formality. That call he'd made earlier hadn't just been a complaint. It had been a call. A reminder that even in the shadows, there were soldiers who still knew loyalty. As Kyle spoke to officers, showing them a security video from a store near the bus stop, everyone's expressions grew more grim. The video wasn't long, but it showed enough. An impatient driver, a slammed door, and a veteran treated like dead weight in front of an apathetic city. One of them commented, in a firm voice, "This is more than disrespect. It is a stain on the honor of us all." Meanwhile, Walter said nothing. And perhaps that was the most painful thing. Because he had always been one to speak little, but even that little seemed to have disappeared now. Margaret brought the tea and placed it on the little table next to him. She sat down slowly, not daring to look at him. But after a while, she dared to ask, "Do you still remember that speech the general gave in Washington?" Walter took a while to answer. His eyes finally moved toward her. And then, in a low voice, rough as dry gravel, he said, "Yes, I remember. And I remember how important I felt, at least for a few minutes." Margaret pressed her lips together, and she said nothing, because any words at that moment would seem too weak. Outside, a car drove slowly past the house. That kind of vehicle wasn't common in the neighborhood. It was black, with tinted windows, but it continued on its way without stopping. At the military base, the group gathered with Kyle was already planning their next steps. The commander, a man with a restrained speech and straight posture, adjusted his glasses and said, "If the government has forgotten, we have not forgotten. Let's show that there is still respect in this country." And with that decision, everything started to move. Phones were ringing. Teams went into action. A plan began to take shape. A silent plan, but one that carried something much greater than justice. It carried a ransom. An attempt to restore at least a piece of the honor that had been so coldly taken away that morning. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Walter got out of his chair on the porch and went inside the house. Margaret stayed behind, looking at the red sky as if searching for answers in the clouds. She took a deep breath. She didn't know it, but something inside her began to change at that moment, as if, without realizing it, an ancient force was rising again. And at the same time, the bus driver finished his shift and returned to the terminal. He got off whistling, mocking something on the phone. He had no idea what was already being prepared. Because there are actions that seem small, but cause waves. And that was exactly what started to happen there. An invisible, silent movement, but with the potential to transform everything. Those who live on the margins know how to recognize when something is about to break the cycle. And in that quiet neighborhood, where pain so often went unnoticed, a cycle was about to be broken. Write in the comments. There are things we cannot ignore. The bus terminal in downtown Greenville was a place of worn-out routines. People came and went, always in a hurry, always in silence. At the end of the line, the driver took a slow drag on his cigarette while telling lame jokes to his colleague, as if it had been just another day. The wet ground reflected the dim lights of the streetlights, and the smell of old oil and smoke permeated the air. Today they almost made me late with my wheelchair. How absurd, he said, laughing, as he tapped the ash on the edge of the concrete bench. Two passengers who were still waiting for the next bus exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them ventured, "I think that guy was a veteran, right?" The driver shrugged. "So what? I'm a driver, not a caregiver." The sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. Hard, harsh, almost like a punch to the stomach of whoever heard it. But he didn't care. He threw the cigarette butt on the ground and crushed it with his shoe, unhurriedly, as if stepping on something worthless. It was then that the sound of discreet sirens began to approach. But this was no ordinary emergency. They were black vehicles with tinted windows, moving forward in a silent line. They did not attract attention with noise. They attracted attention with presence. 3 SUVs with military insignia pulled up slowly behind the bus. The driver's eyes widened. The passenger stood up. And for a brief moment, even the sounds of traffic seemed to stop. The doors of the vehicles opened at the same time. Uniformed men got out with firm posture, serious faces, and direct gaze. There was no rush in their steps. There was conviction. Those watching from afar did not understand what was happening, but they felt that something important was behind it. The driver stood up, confused, trying to adjust his posture. His colleagues moved away in silence. The mood changed. The officer in front took a few steps and stopped in front of him. He didn't shout. He didn't humiliate him. He just looked the driver in the eye and asked, "What is your full name, sir?" "Ralph. Ralph Donnelly," he replied, stammering. "So do you know why we are here?" Ralph swallowed hard. He didn't answer. He just looked around, searching for support among the passengers. But no one moved. No one wanted to share that moment with him. The officer handed over a sheet of paper. It was a formal notice, a complaint, a summons to appear. But more than that, it was a reminder that not everything goes unpunished. You have the right to defend yourself. But today, the country also has the right to defend itself from shame, said the soldier with a tone that mixed firmness and mourning. Ralph sat down, visibly shaken. The cigarette, once a symbol of neglect, now trembled between his fingers. Meanwhile, other soldiers were setting up something next to the terminal. A small wooden stage, flags, microphones. Everything was done with precision. Everything was done quickly, like a team trained to act with honor, even in the smallest details. Curious onlookers were beginning to gather. People with cell phones in their hands, children pulling their parents by the coat. No one understood exactly why, but the name that began to circulate among the officers sparked their curiosity. Walter D. Morgan. A lady with tears in her eyes murmured, "I remember that name. He was honored decades ago." "He was one of our..." A boy commented, "I think he was in the infantry. He lost the use of his legs in the war. My grandfather talked about him." People began to piece together a story that the city had forgotten, or chosen to forget. But now, in the face of all this activity, Walter's name was echoing again. Not in the headlines, but in the mouths and eyes of people who still knew what it meant to acknowledge sacrifice. At the top of the improvised structure, a banner was placed with firm letters. "Honor has no expiration date. It just waits to be recognized." As the final adjustments were being made, Kyle's phone rang. It was the driver of the patrol car who was already on his way to Walter's house. The plan was ready, and nothing would be ignored anymore. On the other side of the city, Margaret was washing the dishes with slow, almost automatic movements. Walter, on the sofa, was dozing in silence. But it was not a peaceful sleep. It was one of those in which the mind does not rest. The body even gives in, but the soul remains alert. Because there are pains that continue to vibrate even in the silence of the night. When the doorbell rang, Margaret was startled. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. When she opened it, she saw a uniformed soldier standing up straight. For a moment, her heart raced. She remembered her time in the hospital. But the man smiled respectfully. "Mrs. Morgan, we've come to pick up Mr. Walter. It's all right. It's a tribute. A fitting one." She didn't understand right away. She looked back at her still sleeping husband. The words took a while to sink in, but the officer's voice was calm. "It's not out of obligation. It's out of merit and out of reparation." Margaret nodded slowly. She walked over to Walter and woke him with a gentle touch on his shoulder. "Walter, they came for you." He opened his eyes, confused. After listening, he hesitated. "Me? But why?" "Because there are still people who haven't forgotten who you are," Margaret replied, with a smile that mixed relief and pain. Walter took a while to accept, but he accepted. The moment the wheels of the chair rolled through the front door, something inside the house changed. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in a long time, Walter felt like he was part of something bigger again. Not as a symbol, but as a man. As the car headed towards the center, the city continued its movement, unaware that, in a few minutes, it would see something that had not happened for decades. Honor being returned. Live in front of everyone. Comment here. There are stories that cannot be erased. The car drove silently through the narrow streets of Greenville, and wherever it went, people turned discreetly. Some recognized the military vehicle and stopped walking, curious. Others just watched, feeling that there was something different in the movement, although they still didn't know what it was. Inside the vehicle, Walter kept his eyes on the window. The city seemed the same as always, but something inside him had changed. That route that he had so often traveled in silence, like just another invisible elderly person among so many, now had a different weight. Beside him, Margaret held his hand tightly, as if afraid to let go and have it all disappear. She said nothing, but her teary eyes revealed everything that had been bottled up for years. The pain of helplessness, of neglect, and now also the astonishment that they were there, together, being carried as guests and not as burdens. Walter glanced at the front seat, where Kyle Thompson was silently following them. The presence of this young officer, whom he barely knew, was beginning to take on a meaning that was hard to explain. Kyle didn't say much, but the respect in every gesture said more than any speech. There was something in that look, a kind of recognition that Walter hadn't seen in decades. The car stopped in front of the central square. What had once been just a passageway had now been transformed. A small stage had been set up next to the bus terminal, surrounded by American flags and dozens of chairs. On the ground, there were simple arrangements, but carefully organized. And above, a banner with bold letters highlighted a phrase that cut into the chest of anyone who read it. Honor is not denied to those who built it with blood. Walter frowned, not fully understanding what was happening. But when the door opened, and he saw the crowd in absolute silence, waiting, his chest tightened. The sounds of the square disappeared for a moment. It was as if time had stopped just for him. Margaret got out first. A soldier came forward to help her. Another positioned himself by the door of the patrol car. Walter, still hesitant, rested his hands on the arms of his chair and took a deep breath. His left leg was shaking, not from exertion, but from memory. Back then, on a military base overseas, he had been greeted with applause when he returned wounded. But that had seemed like a distant movie. Time had swallowed up that scene, replacing it with colder ones. Hospital lines, closing doors, pitying looks, empty promises. Now, in front of that square, something was resurfacing. But along with it, insecurity also came. He didn't know if he deserved it, or if, after so many years of being ignored, he would still be able to receive a gesture of respect without suspecting him. The chair's first step on the pavement was like an echo. People who had been silent before began to stand up. First the older ones, then the younger ones. One by one, everyone stood up. There was no applause. Not yet. But there was a thick presence in the air, something between reverence and collective regret. Kyle walked beside Walter, saying nothing. He simply nodded slightly to the other soldiers, who responded firmly. One of them carried a small blue case, but with a symbolic shine that caught his attention. It was a calculated gesture, but deeply emotional. Margaret stood by her husband, as she always had. But in that moment, her place seemed different. She was no longer just a caring wife. She was a living witness to a history that the country had nearly erased. Walter was led to the front of the stage. The crowd, now made up of onlookers, veterans, young students, and even the town mayor, kept their eyes fixed on him. Some began to whisper. Others just watched in silent respect. A group of motorcyclists in veterans' vests stood at the back, arms crossed, eyes brimming with tears. The official in charge of the event stepped up to the microphone. His voice was firm, but full of emotion. Today, Greenville stops for a reason that should be obvious, but that, unfortunately, we need to remember. This man, standing here before us, is Walter D. Morgan, war veteran, Medal of Honor recipient, soldier wounded in action, a hero among us. The words echoed through the square. Walter squeezed his eyes shut, holding back his emotions. But Margaret couldn't hold them back. Tears fell uncontrollably. The officer continued, "Earlier today, this same man was prevented from boarding a public bus. He was treated with disdain, ignored, humiliated. But here, now, in front of all of you, we choose to do differently. We choose to remember. We choose to honor." At that moment, the soldier next to him approached and opened the case. Inside was a shiny medal. It wasn't the same one Walter had received in the past. It was a different one. One created especially to recognize veterans who had suffered civil neglect and yet maintained their dignity. A rare decoration. And a powerful one. The officer bowed before Walter and pinned the medal to his shirt. The crowd then applauded. But what no one knew is that Walter carried a carefully folded, yellowed piece of paper in the inside pocket of his jacket. A handwritten note from a war comrade who died in his arms. The message read, "If one day they forget, remember me for them." And at that moment, without saying a word, Walter took the paper out of his pocket, calmly unfolded it, and showed it to Kyle. The young officer read it, was moved, and made a firm gesture to the troops. At the same moment, the surrounding military personnel saluted. And one by one, all the civilians followed suit. Walter looked up at the sky, holding back burning tears. Margaret squeezed his hand. And there, in downtown Greenville, the story was no longer about an old man in a chair. It was about legacy, about reparations, about the kind of transformation that begins quietly, but when it explodes, it changes everything. Write it down. I refuse to forget. Walter kept his head up, but his eyes were moist. The sun was breaking through the clouds, as if choosing that exact moment to illuminate the square. The applause was still echoing, and even though he had already faced gunshots, explosions, the death of comrades, and the loss of his own legs, that silent commotion took him apart. It was different from war. In war, the pain came from outside. Here, it came from inside. The mayor approached. He was visibly moved, holding a speech that was shaking in his hands. He tried to begin, but had to take a deep breath. His voice faltered on the first attempt. On the second, he came out. "Walter D. Morgan, this city has failed you. I have failed you. But today, in front of everyone, we acknowledge it, and we thank you." The crowd fell silent. The sentence weighed heavily, and that was what made it all so real. It wasn't a political ceremony. It was a reckoning with the hidden truth of many places. Heroes forgotten by those who should remember them first. The bus driver, head down in the crowd, was pale. The arrogant expression from hours before had disappeared. In its place was a man who seemed small, not because of his height, but because of the shame he could no longer hide. He tried to shrink into the crowd, but everything around him screamed at what he had done, and what he had failed to do. A little boy, on his father's lap, pointed to Walter and asked loudly, "Daddy, did he save America?" The father responded with a discreet nod and teary eyes. "He saved more than that, son. He saved the most beautiful thing we have. Courage." Walter listened. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to make Margaret squeeze his hand tightly. She was smiling too, for the first time in a long time. The microphone was passed to Kyle. He hesitated. He looked at Walter, and when he began to speak, his voice was firm but full of emotion. "I am Lieutenant Kyle Thompson. I have served in fields that many here only know about from the news. I have seen bravery. I have seen pain. I have seen sacrifice. But I have never seen anything like what I saw that morning. A man being ignored, not because he was weak, but because he was forgotten." He paused. The people were completely silent. Mr. Walter Morgan asked for nothing. No respect, no recognition. He simply continued his journey in silence. And it was this silence that forced me to act, because what he represented could no longer be expressed in words. Kyle then revealed that the medal given to Walter was not only a tribute, but also a milestone. From that day on, all veterans in the city would have priority on public transportation. And more than that, they would be recognized in a memorial to be built right there, in that square. The crowd applauded again. But now, loudly. With tears. With truth. And there, in the center of it all, Walter cried. He cried like he hadn't cried since the funeral of his best friend in uniform. The tears weren't of pain. They were of relief. It was as if years of contempt had finally dissolved in those palms. That was when a man in an old cap with a faded insignia walked through the crowd, leaning on a cane. He reached the front of the stage, stopped in front of Walter, and saluted. His hand was shaking, but his gesture was firm. "Captain Morgan, Delta Company, 1971. I never forgot." Walter's eyes widened. That face, more wrinkled now, but still familiar. It was Joseph. The soldier he thought had died in the attack where he lost his legs. The same one who disappeared on the battlefield after being taken away by a helicopter. For decades, Walter believed he had not survived. Joseph then approached, touched Walter's shoulder, and said in a choked voice, "You saved me, brother, and I came here to tell you this. After so long, it was my time to thank you." Silence turned to emotion. People were crying in every direction. The past and the present met in the most unlikely place, the heart of a square that was previously ignored, and now revered. Margaret sobbed with emotion. Kyle lowered his head. The mayor wiped his face with a handkerchief. And Walter just let the tears flow. And the most beautiful thing is that, even without wanting to, that man began to teach again. With his posture. With his dignity. With the silence that said more than any speech. He showed that a true hero doesn't need to shout. He just remains. And when the world is silent, his story speaks for him. Write in the comments, "I still believe in true courage." The sun had not yet reached the top of the sky when Walter calmly pushed open the front door. The ancient sound of the hinges sounded different this morning. It was no longer the creak of a forgotten house. It was the silent announcement of a new beginning. Margaret followed close behind him, her step firm and her gaze alert, as always. But there was something different about them now. It was not youth. That was long gone. It was dignity restored. On the bookshelf in the living room, among faded photo frames and books with worn spines, Walter carefully placed the little blue box where the medal rested. He didn't display it in a prominent place. He just left it there, among the everyday objects, because it wasn't about showing off glory. It was about rediscovering value. The kind of value that time tried to erase, but that silently survived in the eyes of those who never stopped believing. But what really changed wasn't on the bookshelf. It was on the streets. The next morning, Margaret insisted that they leave. She said they had to go to the market like they had done before everything went wrong. Walter hesitated, but gave in. His old coat still fit, and the chair was clean and well kept. As they turned the corner onto the main avenue, the bus stop appeared on the horizon. But it was not the same anymore. There, fixed with new screws and fresh paint, was a silver plaque. Small, discreet, but with words that carried more weight than any monument. Point Walter D. Morgan, so that the world never forgets that respect also has a name. Margaret stopped immediately. She put her hand to her chest and pressed her lips together, trying to hold back her tears. Walter said nothing. But his eyes were shining. And this time, it wasn't a memory of pain. It was presence. He was there again, a part of this place. Not an obstacle, not a nuisance, but someone who had been seen. The new driver, a young man with an honest look, got off the bus and insisted on opening the ramp with his own hands. He helped Walter get on, with respect in his gestures, without rushing, without obligation. Just humanity. Inside, the passengers fell silent. One of them stood up. He offered the front seat. Another nodded. No one needed to say anything. Because when respect is true, it speaks without words. And yet, deep in his soul, Walter could still feel the echo of the years when everything had been too quiet. Of the times Margaret had pushed her chair down dirty alleys just to avoid prying eyes. Of the doors that had closed without even listening. Of the days when he had wanted to disappear. But there was a difference now. Because even with all those scars, the city had changed. And he knew he wasn't the only one responsible. He wasn't a hero for having suffered, but for not having given up. Because there are people who save their country on the battlefield, and continue to do so in silence, just by existing. At the fair, the merchants recognized them. A lady at the cash register, who had never looked Walter in the eye, now came out from behind the counter just to shake his hand. A boy asked for a photo. An old man took off his hat and said, "This is what I was hoping to see before I left." And the most curious thing was what happened when they returned home. In the mailbox was an envelope with no return address. Walter opened it slowly. Inside was a plain piece of paper, a single sentence, handwritten. "The silence you carried taught us more than all the speeches." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. It hurt, but it was a good pain. The kind that cleanses your chest from the inside. He rested his head on Margaret's shoulder and lay there for long minutes, listening to the wind. The world outside was still imperfect. There would still be other drivers, other closed doors, other humiliations. But now, something had broken, and the current of this transformation continued. By late afternoon, the square that had once been a scene of neglect was now covered in flowers. Children played near the simple monument that was beginning to be built. Volunteers, civilians, and military personnel worked together. Without fanfare, without propaganda, just with purpose. Margaret sat beside Walter on the porch. The tea was growing cold in the cup, but no one cared. They didn't need to say anything. They had lived too long to waste words, and as the sky changed color, a new feeling took over that home. It wasn't just relief, it was reconciliation. With the city, with memory, with the country, but above all, with the past itself. Write in the comments, silence also speaks. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched a chord somewhere deep inside you. Maybe it reminded you of someone who deserves to be remembered. Maybe it awakened a feeling that was dormant. That's why this channel exists, to tell stories that still carry value, truth, and purpose. even when the world is so noisy and distracted. If this content made sense to you, leave a "I saw it through to the end" in the comments. I read everything, and that's how we know who's really walking this journey together. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. There are many stories like this coming up, and if you felt this one was worth your time, leave a like. It helps keep this kind of message alive for longer, for more people. And since you've stayed this far, there's a video here that talks directly to this story. Click on it and continue with me there. I think it'll do you good too.